The morning Georgia Wallace buried her second horse, she decided she was done grieving things she could not afford to replace. And yet the grief came anyway, swelling up behind her sternum like floodwater behind a dam that had already cracked once before. She stood at the edge of the south pasture with a shovel in her calloused hands, and the New Mexico sun beating down on the back of her neck with a cruelty that felt almost personal. The horse had been old, older than it had any right to be out here in the territory where everything seemed to age faster than God intended. But she had loved that animal the way you love things that have carried you through your worst years without complaint. She drove the shovel into the red earth one final time, patted the mound flat with the back of the blade, and walked back toward the house without looking behind her. The house was not much to look at from the outside. It sat low against a ridge of piñon and juniper, its adobe walls patched in 3 places where the winter had done what winters in the territory always did, which was remind you that nothing you built was truly permanent. But inside, Georgia had made it hers in every possible way. There were curtains she had sewn from flour sacks dyed with indigo she had traded for at the mercantile in Cimarron. There was a cast iron stove that she had driven a wagon 40 miles to collect when the previous owner of a neighboring homestead had sold everything and gone back east, broken by the land as so many of them were. There were shelves of preserved goods lined up with a precision that spoke not of abundance, but of careful, stubborn management, of someone who had learned that the difference between surviving the winter and not surviving it was measured in half jars of pickled beets and rationed coffee. Georgia was 31 years old in the autumn of 1878, which meant she had been a widow for 4 years, and a woman alone on 40 acres in Colfax County, New Mexico Territory for nearly as long. Her husband, Robert Wallace, had died in the fall of 1874, not from violence or accident as so many men in the territory did, but from a fever that had come on fast and left faster, taking him from a healthy man to a dead one in less than 9 days. She had held his hand through all 9 of them, and when it was over she had stood in the yard behind the house and screamed once, a single raw sound that scattered the birds from every tree within a quarter mile, and then she had never screamed again. There was no one to hear it anyway. There was no one to help. Robert had left her with the house, the 40 acres, 7 head of cattle, a mule named Dorcas who was as stubborn as the land itself, and a debt at the bank in Cimarron that felt like a stone she carried inside her chest at all times. He had left her with no children, which was its own particular grief, the kind she did not discuss with anyone because there was no one to discuss it with, and because some griefs are too private for words even if you have people around to speak them to. She had paid the bank debt down to almost nothing through 4 years of work that most men she had ever met could not have sustained. She had grown her cattle herd from 7 to 23 through careful breeding and harder negotiations at the livestock market in Springer. She had planted a kitchen garden that produced more than she needed, and she sold the surplus at the Saturday market in Cimarron, alongside the women who came in on buckboards with their husbands, the women who looked at Georgia with something caught between admiration and pity, and she could never quite decide which one irritated her more. She had done all of it alone. Every fence post driven, every roof patch laid, every calf pulled on a cold night when the mother was struggling, and Georgia was kneeling in the dark of the barn with lantern light making wild shadows on the walls. She had done it because there was nothing else to do. The land did not care about your grief. The land did not pause to let you mourn. You got up in the morning and you worked until you could not work anymore, and then you slept and you got up again, and that was the entirety of the arrangement. She was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold when she saw the rider. He came in from the north, which was unusual, because the north road out of Cimarron was the longer way around, and most people who had business at her place came up from the south, where the track off the main road met her gate. He was riding a dark bay horse that moved well despite what looked like hard miles on both the animal and the man. He was dressed like a cowboy, which was to say he was dressed like half the men in the territory, in canvas trousers and a worn canvas duster that had probably started out as tan and had been weathered to a color that was approximately the same as the land itself. He wore a hat pulled low against the sun, and he sat his saddle like someone who had been doing it long enough that it was simply the natural position of his body in the world. Georgia set down her cold coffee and picked up the Winchester that stood beside the back door. She did not carry it outside. She simply moved it to where her hand could reach it quickly if the need arose. Then she walked out onto the porch and waited. The rider pulled up at the gate, which was closed, and he stopped there and looked at her across the distance between them with what appeared to be no particular hurry in his manner. He took off his hat, which was a gesture she noted and appreciated, because some of the men who came to her place did not bother with that, as if the absence of a husband in the picture meant the ordinary courtesies did not apply. She walked down off the porch and across the yard to the gate, keeping her expression neutral. Up close she could see that he was perhaps 35, maybe a year or two either side of that, with a face that had been put through enough weather to give it character without quite hardening it into the closed-off blankness she saw on men who had been in the territory too long and given up on soft things entirely. He had dark eyes under a straight brow and a jaw that was in need of a razor, but not so badly that it looked like he had given up on the idea entirely. There was a scar along the left side of his jaw, thin and old, the kind of thing that had stopped being remarkable to him a long time ago. "Can I help you?" Georgia said. "I believe you're Georgia Wallace," he said. His voice was a low, unhurried thing, not quite Southern but with something in it that suggested he had come from somewhere east of the Mississippi before the West had gotten into his bones. "I am," she said. "And you are?" "Silas Holloway," he said. He said it the way people say names they have carried without particular pride or shame, simply a fact, the name a thing they have made a kind of peace with. "I was told in Cimarron that you might be needing a hand." Georgia looked at him steadily. "Who told you that?" "A man named Purvis at the Mercantile. He said you lost your hired man 3 weeks back and that you've got cattle need moving before the first hard freeze." This was true. Hector Mendez, who had worked for her for 2 years and was the best ranch hand she had ever known, had gone back to his family in Taos when his mother had taken ill, and she had not found anyone to replace him, and the calendar was moving toward October with no interest in slowing down. She had cattle on the upper pasture that needed to come down, fencing on the east side that needed mending before winter, and firewood that needed splitting and stacking. And she was one person with 2 hands and not enough hours in any given day. She looked at Silas Holloway and tried to read him the way 4 years of being alone had taught her to read men who rode up to her gate. She looked for the easy confidence of a man who assumed a woman alone was easy. She looked for the restless eyes of a man running from something specific and dangerous. She looked for the slight looseness around the mouth that meant he drank more than occasionally. She did not find any of those things. What she found was a man who met her gaze directly and waited with patience that seemed genuine rather than performed. "I pay fair wages," she said finally. $3 a week and board. The bunkhouse is clean. I expect honest work, and I do not tolerate drinking on the property or dishonesty of any kind. Those are not negotiable." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile but in the neighborhood of one. "Those are fair terms, Mrs. Wallace. There's a barn needs mucking this afternoon and about a cord of wood needs splitting before dark," she said. "Consider that your interview." She opened the gate and stepped back, and Silas Holloway rode through it and dismounted in a single fluid motion, and that was how it began. He worked that afternoon with a quiet competence that Georgia observed from various distances, none of them close enough to be obvious, all of them close enough to be certain. He split wood with the economical rhythm of a man who had done it 10,000 times and had stopped thinking about it, letting his body do the mathematics of angle and force, while his attention seemed to be somewhere else entirely, probably cataloging the state of the property, the way a capable man will do when he is new to a place. He mucked the barn thoroughly and spread fresh straw without being told where it was kept. He checked the water in the horse trough and, finding it low, filled it from the pump without making a production of having noticed the oversight. At supper she set a plate for him at the table, because the bunkhouse had no cook stove, and she had told him board was part of the wages, and she was a woman who kept to the terms she set. He came in clean, having used the pump to wash up, and he sat across from her and ate her stew with what appeared to be genuine appreciation, and he did not talk too much, which was in his favor, and he did not fail to talk at all, which was also in his favor, because silence at a supper table between two strangers can become a thing with weight to it if it goes on long enough. "How long have you been working this place alone?" he asked, between the stew and the cornbread. "Since my hired man left 3 weeks ago," she said. "I mean before that," he said, and looked up from his plate to meet her eyes, and there was nothing forward or presumptuous in the way he said it, just directness, the kind that came from being around enough hardship that small talk felt like a thing to move through rather than a destination. "4 years," she said, "with help for 2 of those." He nodded. He looked around the room, at the straight shelves and the patched but clean walls and the curtains in the windows, and she could see him doing the calculation of it, the 40 acres and the cattle and the preserved goods, and the whole carefully managed enterprise of one woman keeping herself alive and solvent in country that had swallowed greater ambitions than hers. "You built something real here," he said, and the simplicity of it, the absence of surprise or condescension in his voice, was something she was not prepared for, and she looked down at her own plate and felt something shift slightly in the architecture of her chest. "I intend to keep it," she said. He worked the next morning before she was up, which meant he was up before 4 o'clock because she was never in bed past 4:15, and she came out of the house to find the chickens already fed, and the milk cow already tended, and Silas standing at the fence of the near pasture looking north at the mountains with a cup of coffee in his hand, and an expression she could not read from behind. She poured her own coffee and stood on the porch and looked at the mountains herself. They were the color of iron in the early light, the Sangre de Cristo range running north along the edge of the sky, and there was snow on the highest peaks already, which was the first real signal that October meant business this year. "Those cattle need to come down this week," she said. He turned around. "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "How many head up there?" 11, she said. "The upper pasture is good grazing, but it catches ice fast once the cold sets in properly. Lost 2 animals up there the second winter because I couldn't get to them in time." She had not intended to say that. The lost cattle were part of the ledger of her private failures, the things she kept track of not to torment herself, but to make certain she did not repeat them, and she did not usually share them with people she had known for fewer than 24 hours. He did not wince or offer the kind of empty consolation that well-meaning people sometimes deployed like a bandage over a wound they did not want to look at directly. He simply nodded, taking it in as information about the land and the conditions and the stakes, which was exactly how she thought about it. "We can bring them down today if you want," he said. "I'd like to ride the upper pasture first, get the lay of it." "I'll ride with you," she said, because she always rode her own land, because she had learned that abdicating that kind of knowledge to someone else was how you ended up dependent on their eyes instead of your own. If he had any reaction to that, any flicker of the particular masculine sensitivity she had encountered in some men, when a woman indicated she was going to do a thing herself rather than delegate it to them, she did not see it. He simply set down his coffee cup and went to saddle the horses. They rode up the mountain together that morning, and the sky above them was the hard, brilliant blue of a New Mexico October, the kind of blue that seems painted on rather than atmospheric, and the aspens had gone gold, and the air smelled of pine resin and cold coming. Georgia rode her roan mare, the only horse she had left since losing the old sorrel, and she watched Silas on the dark bay and noted the easy authority with which he moved across terrain that was new to him, reading the ground and the slope, and the layout of the land with attention that was clearly natural rather than performed. They found the cattle without trouble and spent the better part of the morning pushing them down the mountain, which was work that went easier with two people than she had imagined it going with one, which she had been grimly prepared for because she had been grimly prepared to do it alone. The animals came down without too much drama, moving through the piñon stands in a stream of brown and red, and the particular bawling that cattle produce when asked to do anything they have not chosen for themselves. There was a moment in the middle of the morning when one of the steers broke left and went crashing through the brush toward a steep draw, and Georgia was already turning her horse to go after him when Silas was simply there ahead of her, cutting the steer off from the draw and turning him back toward the herd with an efficiency that suggested he had done this specific thing in this specific kind of terrain before, which told her something about where he might have worked before. Somewhere with mountains and piñon scrub and stubborn cattle. "Thank you," she said when he rode back. "You'd have had him," he said, which was the right thing to say. By noon, the cattle were in the lower pasture, and Georgia stood at the fence counting them and was satisfied with the number and said so. And Silas unsaddled the horses and they ate lunch on the porch, which was bread and dried beef and apples from the small tree behind the house that had surprised her by thriving in the alkaline soil, and the whole of it was surprisingly companionable for two people who had not known each other existed 3 days ago. "Where are you from originally?" she asked because she had been wondering about the slight eastern cast of his voice, and because it seemed reasonable 3 days in to be curious. "Missouri," he said. Before I was old enough to remember choosing it, Ohio." "What brought you this far west?" He considered the apple in his hand for a moment. "The same thing that brings most people," he said. "Started moving and couldn't find a good reason to stop." It was an honest non-answer, and she appreciated its honesty even while noting what it did not say. There were men in the territory who had come west to outrun something specific, a past or a reputation or a particular kind of sorrow, and she had learned not to ask too hard about the thing they were running from because the asking sometimes made them leave before they had been useful enough to justify the asking. "Have you got family?" she asked instead. "Not anymore," he said, and the simplicity of it carried its own weight. She did not push on it. "Neither do I," she said, which was her own honest non-answer, and they understood each other across the comfortable silence that followed it. In the following week he repaired the east fence, which had been a project she had been pushing back for 3 months because it was a 2-person job and she only had 1 person. He worked methodically, post by post, and when she came out to check his progress on the second afternoon, he was pulling wire with the kind of tension that would hold against cattle, and weather for years if the posts were good. And the posts were good because he had set them well and packed the soil correctly. She stood at the end of the fence line and looked at the work and felt something that was not quite relief and not quite gratitude and was possibly something more complicated than either. She brought him coffee in the field that afternoon and they stood side by side in the October sun looking at the repaired fence line, and she found herself noticing for the first time, or perhaps more accurately admitting for the first time, that standing next to him felt different from standing next to anyone she had stood next to in a long time. He was tall enough that she had to adjust her angle slightly to look at his face, and he smelled of honest work and the particular sweetness of dried grass and horse. And when he turned to take the coffee from her, their fingers touched briefly on the cup and neither of them made anything of it, but the contact lingered in her awareness longer than it had any practical reason to. She walked back to the house thinking about the inventory of winter supplies that needed checking and telling herself that was all she was thinking about. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday, which seemed like an inappropriately ordinary day for trouble. She had gone into Cimarron for supplies and had been standing in Purvis's mercantile when a man named Clarence Dodd had come in, a man she knew by reputation as someone who bought up land from people who were struggling, and whose methods of encouraging that struggle were not always above board. He was a heavy-set man with small eyes and a manner that suggested he had long ago arrived at the conclusion that most things in the world were available for purchase if you had enough patience and enough cash. He greeted her with the particular warmth of a man who wants something and is willing to be pleasant in the acquisition of it. "Mrs. Wallace," he said, "I've been meaning to come out and see you. I heard you lost your man Mendez." "I have new help," she said, keeping her voice even. "Temporary help, I imagine," Dodd said. "Cowboys tend to move on." "Mr. Dodd," Georgia said, loading her voice with the pleasant finality she had developed for exactly these conversations, "my affairs are in order, my cattle are healthy, and my property is not available. I say that kindly and I say it once." His smile did not waver, but his eyes did something complicated behind it. "A woman alone out on that ridge in winter," he said. "It's a hard situation, Mrs. Wallace. I'm only saying that if circumstances ever make the burden too heavy, my offer stands." "Good day, Mr. Dodd," she said, and turned back to her supplies list. She told Silas about Dodd that evening at supper, not because she needed counsel or protection. She had been handling Clarence Dodd's interest in her property for the better part of 2 years, and she did not need a man to do that handling for her, but because he was living on her property and she believed he had a right to understand the context of it. Silas listened without interrupting, which she had already come to understand was his natural mode. He had a stillness about him when he was listening that was not passivity but attention, the quality of someone who has learned that most information arrives in the spaces that other people leave when they have finished talking. "He's been making offers for 2 years, he said when she finished. "Since about 6 months after Robert died," she said. "When he calculated I was far enough past the initial grief to be approachable, but not yet far enough past it to have proven I could manage on my own. He underestimated you. Most people do," she said, without bitterness, as a plain statement of fact. "I've learned to consider it an advantage." Silas looked at her across the table with an expression that was harder to categorize than his usual directness, something in it that was warm in a way that made her look down at her coffee cup. "What's your plan if he escalates?" he asked. "I have a lawyer in Cimarron who knows the situation," she said. "The deed is clear. The bank note is almost paid. In the spring I will have made the last payment and the property will be entirely mine with no leverage left for anyone to apply." "How much is left on the note?" She told him the number and watched his expression to see if he would flinch at it or do the calculation of her vulnerability the way men sometimes did, seeing a sum of money owed as evidence of weakness rather than evidence of someone who had been managing a difficult set of circumstances with imperfect tools. He did neither of those things. He simply nodded. "Then the thing to do is get to spring," he said. "Yes," she said. "The thing to do is get to spring." There was a quality to the quiet that followed that was different from the quiet of their earlier evenings. Not comfortable exactly, but charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. The kind of quiet that is not actually quiet at all, but is full of things that have not yet been said and may or may not need to be. Georgia cleared the dishes and Silas went to the bunkhouse, and she stood at the kitchen window in the dark for a while thinking about nothing in particular, which she had learned over 4 years meant she was thinking about something specific that she was not ready to name. October deepened and the work went on, and the days began to take on a quality she had not experienced in a long time, the quality of days that are anticipated rather than simply endured. She caught herself listening for the sound of him in the mornings, the scrape of the pump handle or the sound of the axe in the woodpile, sounds that had become associated with the fact that she was not alone in the particular way she had been alone before, not just without a person, but without someone whose presence in her world registered. He was not effusive. He did not flatter her or press himself upon her attention. He worked hard, and he was honest about what he knew and equally honest about what he did not know, which was a rarer quality in men than it should have been. He asked her questions about the land with genuine interest, not the performance of interest that men sometimes offered women when they wanted something, but the kind that led somewhere, that built a picture, that made it clear he was learning her property because he cared about understanding it. On a Thursday in mid-October, they were mending the roof of the small outbuilding she used for grain storage, and the afternoon light was going golden and low across the pasture, and she was handing him boards from below while he knelt on the roof and nailed them into place. And there was a domesticity to the whole arrangement that she recognized suddenly as something she had missed without ever letting herself name the missing. He looked down at her from the roof and said, "You ever think about adding a second grazing pasture on the west side? The soil looks good over there." "I think about it," she said. "It would need fencing and a water line from the main well. It's a spring project." "I could draw up a rough plan," he said, "if you want another set of eyes on the layout." She looked up at him against the sky. This man who had arrived at her gate 3 weeks ago on a tired horse with no particular place to be, who had slept in her bunkhouse and eaten at her table and worked her land with the care of someone who intended to stay. And she thought about the word that had been sitting at the edge of her awareness since the first week. The word she had been refusing to pick up and examine, because examining it meant acknowledging it, and acknowledging it meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was the one thing she had been most careful not to allow herself for 4 years. "I would like that," she said. His eyes held hers for a beat longer than necessary, and then he went back to the nailing, and she went back to the boards, and neither of them said anything further, but something had been communicated that had no efficient verbal form. That night she sat at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp burning and her ledger open in front of her, but she was not looking at the ledger. She was thinking about Robert, which she did not do every day anymore, which had once felt like a betrayal and now felt simply like the natural passage of time doing what time does. Robert had been a good man. He had been kind, and he had worked hard, and he had loved her in the straightforward, uncomplicated way of someone who had chosen simply and been sure of the choice. His death had taken a version of her future away from her, the version where she was not alone, where the weight of this land was shared, where there was someone across the table every night whose face was familiar in the particular way that only years of proximity can make a face familiar. She had not allowed herself to want that again. She had told herself in the hard early years that wanting it was a form of weakness she could not afford. And then later, when the land was more secure, she had told herself that wanting it was a risk she had no interest in taking, because the arithmetic of losing someone a second time was not arithmetic she wished to perform. But there was Silas Holloway in her bunkhouse, who had ridden up to her gate and told her he was a man looking for work and had set about proving it every day since. And she was sitting at her table at 10 o'clock at night, thinking about the way his voice sounded when he was describing the West Pasture's expansion possibilities, which told her with a clarity she could not argue with that the arithmetic she had refused to perform was already being performed without her permission. Somewhere in the parts of herself that did not consult her ledger, she closed the ledger and went to bed and did not sleep for a long time. November came in cold, and the snow that had been threatening from the peaks came down to the lower elevations, and Georgia and Silas spent 3 days getting the remaining cattle sorted, and the grain stores checked, and the root cellar sealed against the hard cold, working side by side through tasks that were familiar to her and becoming familiar to him. And in the familiarity, she found something she had forgotten was available to a person. The ease of working alongside someone who read your intentions before you had fully formed them, who anticipated the next task without needing to be directed to it, who shared not just the work but the rhythm of the work. She came into the barn on the second evening of the cold snap to find him sitting on an overturned crate in the lamplight, replacing a broken buckle on the harness, with the steady focus of a man who is entirely present in the task he is doing. And the scene was so unremarkable in one sense. Just a man repairing equipment in a barn, the most ordinary thing in the territory, and so completely arresting in another that she stood in the doorway for a moment before she spoke. "Supper's ready," she said. He looked up, and the lamplight was making odd warm things happen to the planes of his face, and he said, "I'll be right in." And she turned and went back to the house and stood at the stove and told herself to be sensible. She was not sensible. It happened on a Sunday evening in the second week of November, which was not an occasion she had planned or prepared for. They had been sitting at the table after supper with coffee, which had become a regular enough occurrence that she no longer thought of it as unusual. The extension of the evening into something that was not quite work and not quite leisure, but somewhere in between. Talking about things with the particular freedom that develops between two people who have been working hard together and have arrived at a mutual understanding that is not quite friendship and not quite something else but is close to both. He had been telling her about a ranch he had worked in Colorado, one of the big operations in the San Luis Valley, and there was something in the way he described the landscape there, the flatness of the valley floor ringed by mountains, that made her think he had been happy there, and then not happy, and she wanted to know why but did not ask. She asked something adjacent to it instead. She asked whether he had left a place he wanted to stay. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee cup with an expression she had learned by now to identify as the expression of a man who is deciding how honestly to answer a question. "There was a woman," he said finally, "in Colorado. We were together for 2 years and I thought it was going somewhere, and then I found out it wasn't. She had a husband back in Kansas she hadn't mentioned. He came looking for her in the spring of '76, and that was that." Georgia was quiet. The lamp between them cast its small circle of warmth. "I'm sorry," she said, because she knew the particular quality of that kind of loss, the kind where the grief is complicated by having been made a fool of as well. "I left Colorado after that," he said. "Worked in Arizona for a while, came up into the territory when I heard there was work." He looked up from the coffee cup to her face, and his eyes held something that was both careful and direct at the same time, the expression of a man who is choosing his words with more care than usual. "I'm not the kind of man who is casual about things," he said. "I want you to know that." She understood what he was saying without him having to construct a more explicit architecture around it, because she was the kind of woman who had learned to understand the architecture of things. "I am not a casual woman," she said. "I am also a woman who has spent 4 years being sufficient to herself, and who is not looking for someone to take that sufficiency away from her." "I wouldn't want to take anything away from you," he said. "What you've built here is yours. That's not a thing I'd want to diminish or absorb. That's a thing I'd want to stand alongside if that's ever something you were interested in." She looked at him across the table, and the lamp burned between them, and outside the wind was picking up against the walls of the house that she had patched and repaired and made habitable through 4 years of solitary effort. And she thought about all the reasons to say nothing, all the sensible, self-protective reasons to thank him for his candor, and redirect the conversation to the spring cattle plan or the state of the root cellar. And she found, to her own faint surprise, that the reasons were less convincing than they had been even 2 weeks ago. "I think," she said carefully, "that you are the first person who has ever described it in those terms. Standing alongside." "Yes," she said, "most people describe it as helping, or managing for me, or as though the 40 acres are something I have survived in spite of rather than built on purpose." "You built it on purpose," he said, with a certainty that was not flattery but recognition, and the difference between flattery and recognition was something Georgia Wallace understood in her bones. She stood up from the table, and he stood up too, not quickly, just naturally, the movement of a man who does not want there to be a table between himself and a woman he has just been honest with. And she came around the side of the table, and he was close enough that she could see the weathering around his eyes and the careful hope in them, the hope of someone who has been disappointed before and is walking toward the thing he wants anyway, because not walking toward it is worse. She put her hand against the side of his jaw, the side with the scar, and he went very still under her touch and closed his eyes for just a moment, and then opened them, and looked at her with an expression that was so unguarded it was almost difficult to look at. The expression of a person who has been performing competence and self-sufficiency for so long that being seen clearly by another person is something close to overwhelming. She kissed him, which was the first time she had kissed anyone since Robert, and it was not like anything she had been bracing against or preparing herself for. It was simply warm and honest and entirely mutual, and when she stepped back she found that her hands were shaking slightly, which surprised her, and from the look on his face she thought his might be too. And the absurdity and the beauty of two self-sufficient people shaking at the knees over a kiss in a lamplit kitchen in New Mexico territory in November was not lost on her, and she laughed, which made him laugh, and the laughing was in some ways more intimate than the kiss. They did not rush anything after that evening. Georgia was not a woman who rushed things, and Silas had demonstrated himself to be a patient man, and the particular patience of two people who have found something worth taking care of is a different quality from ordinary patience. It was the patience of tending, of the slow deepening of a thing that is being given room to grow correctly instead of being forced. He continued to sleep in the bunkhouse, and she continued to sleep in the house, and they continued to take supper together every evening, and the dynamic between them shifted in ways that were perceptible only in the small accumulations. The way he handed her a hammer or a cup, or the reins of her horse with a touch that had intention in it now rather than only practicality. The way she smiled at him across the cattle pen in the morning, when he was doing something she had once done alone. The way the silence between them when they were working together had a warmth to it that silences between people who love each other have. The warmth of two people who are comfortable enough that they do not need to perform their presence for each other. Clarence Dodd came to the property on a Tuesday in late November. Georgia was in the barn when she heard the horse in the yard, and she came out to find Dodd on a gray gelding with two other men behind him, men she did not know, men who had the particular look of men hired more for their size than their conversation. Dodd was looking around the yard with an appraising expression that she recognized and disliked. He was surprised to see Silas come around the side of the house with a fence rail on his shoulder, and the surprise was followed quickly by a recalibration that she noted. "Mrs. Wallace," Dodd said, tipping his hat to her. "You look well, Mr. Dodd," she said. "I don't recall inviting you." "I happened to be in the area," he said, which was not true, and they both knew it. The Wallace property was not on any road that led anywhere Clarence Dodd had legitimate business. "I thought I'd check in and see how you're getting on heading into winter." "Getting on fine," she said, "as I suspect you can see." His eyes moved to Silas, who had set down the fence rail and was standing at a comfortable distance that was nonetheless specific, the distance of a man who is within reach of a situation if a situation develops. "New hired man," Dodd said. "That's right," Georgia said. "These winter hires tend to be unreliable," Dodd said pleasantly. "Come spring they've gone on to the next place, and a woman alone finds herself in the same position she started in." He smiled, and the smile did not extend to his eyes. "My offer on the property is still open, Mrs. Wallace. I am willing to be very generous." Georgia looked at him and said, with the calm of a woman who has been preparing this specific speech for 2 years and has had sufficient time to perfect every word of it, "Mr. Dodd, my property note will be paid in full by March. At that point, this land will be mine entirely, and you will have no further pretext for concern about my situation. I have a lawyer in Cimarron who is well acquainted with my circumstances and with your interest in them. I ask you now, as I have asked you before, to direct your business interests elsewhere." Dodd's pleasantness slipped for just a moment, and she saw underneath it the calculation of a man who had been inconvenienced rather than the genuine feeling of any kind. He looked at Silas again, and Silas was looking at him with a steady, entirely non-threatening expression that was nonetheless clearly the expression of a man who is paying close attention and who has formed a view about what he is looking at. "Well then," Dodd said, "I'll leave you to it." He turned his horse, and the two men behind him turned theirs, and they rode back down the track, and Georgia watched them go and kept her shoulders straight until they were through the gate. Then she exhaled. Silas was beside her almost immediately. He did not touch her, did not crowd her, simply stood close enough that his presence was a fact and said, "You want to talk to your lawyer this week?" "Yes," she said. "I think that would be prudent." "I'll drive you in if you want company," he said. She looked at him, and the steadiness of him was something she wanted to put her hand against the way you put your hand against a warm wall on a cold day, drawing heat from its solidity. "I would," she said. They drove into Cimarron the following Thursday in her wagon, which was a journey of roughly 2 hours each way over roads that were hard-packed with frost, and rattled the wagon frame in a way that required both of them to brace their feet and hold on to the seat. The intimacy of this, of being jostled together by the road, of the cold air, and the shared blanket across their laps that she had packed without considering whether it implied anything, and then considered whether it implied anything and decided she did not care, was not lost on her. Thomas Alcott, her lawyer, was a spare, precise man who wore a perpetually worried expression but whose worrying was professional rather than personal, and who had served her interests well for 3 years. He received them in his small office on the main street and listened to her account of Dodd's visits with the focused attention of a man taking inventory. "The note," he said. "What is your timeline?" she told him. He nodded, wrote something down. "If you can make that final payment as scheduled, there is nothing Dodd can leverage legally," Alcott said. "His interest in your property is a private business ambition, not a legal entitlement. If he makes any move that crosses from ambition into interference, I want to know immediately." "He came with 2 men I didn't recognize," Georgia said. Alcott looked up. "That changes the character of the visit somewhat," he said. "That's why I'm here," she said. He wrote more things down and said he would put together a formal letter of record documenting the ongoing pattern of Dodd's approaches, which could be useful if anything escalated. And Georgia thanked him and stood to leave, and Silas, who had sat quietly through the whole meeting in the corner chair with his hat in his hands, stood too. "One more thing," Alcott said, looking between them with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided something is not his business but cannot quite resist the observation. "A husband has certain additional legal standing to act on behalf of a property owner, should matters come to that." Georgia looked at him, and then looked at Silas, and Silas was looking at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his honest and unguarded one, and she said, with the serenity of a woman who is saying a very large thing in a very small voice, "I'll keep that in mind, Thomas." They were back in the wagon on the main street of Cimarron, and the afternoon sun was already low in the west, and the cold had gotten serious in the late hour, and she pulled the blanket up and he flicked the reins, and they were headed home before either of them said anything. It was Silas who spoke first. "I don't want you to think that anything Alcott said has any bearing on what I feel about your situation," he said. "I'm not suggesting anything on the basis of legal convenience." "I know that," she said. "I'm suggesting it," he said, keeping his eyes on the horses and the road ahead, "on the basis of what I have been trying to find a right way to say for about 3 weeks. She looked at the side of his face, the jaw with the scar and the hat brim cutting a clean line against the sky. "Then say it the way you've been thinking it," she said. He pulled the horses to a stop at the side of the road and turned to look at her fully in the late afternoon light that was going gold and orange across the mesa. And he was not a man who made speeches, and she was not a woman who required them. But he took her hand in both of his and said, "Georgia, I came to this county looking for work, and I found something I wasn't expecting, and I would like, if you are willing, to spend the rest of my life working this land with you, and standing alongside whatever comes at you that tries to take it away. I know that is a large thing to ask a woman who has been managing without anyone for 4 years, and I know you don't need me, and I am not asking you to need me. I am asking if you might want me." The mesa spread out around them in every direction, and the mountains stood against the sky in the north, and the air smelled of snow coming and wood smoke from somewhere distant. And she looked at this man who had ridden up to her gate in October with nothing much to recommend him, except his willingness to work and his honest eyes and his way of standing alongside rather than in front of. And she thought that the heart was a more practical organ than people gave it credit for. That it kept accurate accounts, even when the mind was pretending it wasn't. And hers had been keeping very accurate accounts of Silas Holloway for 6 weeks. "I might," she said, and the smile that broke across his face was the kind of smile that a person produces when they have been holding their breath for a long time and have finally been given permission to breathe. He kissed her there on the road with the horses patient, and the sun going down over the mesa, and it was colder than it had been in the kitchen on the night of the first kiss, and she did not notice the cold at all. They were married in Cimarron in December, at the small Protestant church on the edge of town, on a Thursday because Thursdays were no different from any other day to the cattle, and the fences, and the work did not stop for ceremony but could accommodate a single day if the ceremony was efficient. Georgia wore a dress she had made herself from dark blue wool, and Silas wore his cleanest shirt and his good hat, and stood beside her in front of the minister, with the contained solemnity of a man at the best moment he has experienced in a considerable time. Thomas Alcott served as witness, looking less worried than usual. The woman who ran the bakery in Cimarron, a stout and cheerful person named Mee Bellamy, who had always been kind to Georgia at the Saturday market, served as the second witness, and hugged Georgia afterward with a warmth that was not related to any legal requirement. "You look the happiest I have ever seen you," Mee said, and Georgia, who did not think of herself as a woman who was demonstrably happy or unhappy in public, considered the statement and found it accurate and could not find a reason to dispute it. They drove home in the dark, which meant they drove home under a sky full of stars of the particular extravagance available only in the high desert in winter, the kind of sky that makes you understand why the old stories put gods up there. And Georgia sat in the wagon next to her husband, which was a word she was still finding her way around the edges of, and felt the warmth of him beside her in the cold, and thought that the line between what she had built alone and what they were going to build together was the right kind of line, the kind that was an addition rather than a division. The winter was hard in the way that winters in the territory are always hard, which is to say that it was a continuous negotiation between human intention and the weather's complete indifference to human intention. There were 3 significant snowfalls between December and February, each one requiring days of digging out, of ensuring the cattle had enough feed, and the water lines were not frozen, and the roof of the grain store was not going to buckle under accumulated weight. They worked through all of it together, and the together was the thing she found herself returning to when she was tired and cold, and her hands ached from the work. The fact of it, the simple material fact that there was another person in the equation now, not rendering her contribution less but making the whole equation different in kind. At night they sat by the stove and she sewed, and he read from the small collection of books she kept on the shelf beside the window. Not romances or sentiment, but practical things, histories and almanacs, and one battered volume of Shakespeare that Robert had owned, and that she had always kept without quite getting around to reading. And sometimes he read passages aloud to her not because they were assigned to any particular romantic moment, but simply because a passage struck him, and he thought she would find it interesting, which she generally did. There was a night in January when the wind was doing something terrifying against the walls of the house, and she had gotten up to check on the stove, and he had gotten up at the same moment, and they had stood in the dark kitchen with the fire noise competing with the wind noise, and he had put his arms around her from behind, and she had leaned into him and felt, with a completeness that was almost disorienting in its simplicity, entirely held. She told him in February, on a morning when the world outside was white and still after the third snowfall, standing at the kitchen window with her hands around her coffee cup, saying it in the plain and direct way she did everything. "I think I'm expecting," she said. He set down the piece of harness he had been working on at the kitchen table and was beside her before she had time to turn around, and his hands were on her shoulders, and she turned, and his face was doing something she had not seen it do before. The face of a man receiving something so much better than what he had allowed himself to expect, that the received thing and the expected thing are nearly incompatible. And his eyes were bright in a way that was entirely unguarded and entirely undone. And she put her hands against his face, and he turned his head and pressed his mouth to her palm, and they stood like that in the white morning light for a long time without needing to say anything about it. "Are you all right?" he asked finally, which was the right question. "I'm well," she said. "I'm better than I've been in a very long time." March came, and with it the final payment on the bank note. She walked into the bank in Cimarron with Silas beside her, and paid the remaining sum to the bank manager, a man named Hartley, who had always treated her with professional respect, if not particular warmth. And Hartley produced the deed with a release document attached, and she signed it and walked out of that bank with the deed to 40 acres of New Mexico territory in her hand and no encumbrances against it, and the mountain air in her face and Silas holding the door for her. And she stood on the boardwalk in the March sunshine and held the document and felt the 4 years of it, the whole weight of the 4 years of fighting for this particular piece of the earth, and breathed in and breathed out and was simply satisfied. Clarence Dodd's interest in the Wallace property appeared after Thomas Alcott's formal letter, and after it became apparent that Georgia had a husband as well as a paid deed to transfer itself to other pursuits. He made no further visits and sent no further messages, and Georgia thought about him occasionally with the dispassionate acknowledgement of someone who has survived a complication and moved on from it. Spring was the season that she had always loved best. The way the land came back from the winter with a reliability that felt personal even though it was entirely not. The way the green came up through the red soil, and the aspens leafed out, and the cattle moved back up the mountain with an eagerness that was the most purely optimistic thing she regularly witnessed. She and Silas expanded the west pasture that spring, running the fence line through 3 weeks of work that was hard and satisfying in equal measure. And when the fence was done, and the water line was laid, and the first cattle moved into the new pasture, she stood at the gate of it with Silas and felt the property around her as something enlarged rather than merely maintained, something growing rather than merely surviving. She taught him things about the land that she had learned through necessity, the particular way the drainage ran from the north ridge after heavy rain, and where you had to reinforce to keep it from undermining the lower fence, the temperament of each of the cattle well enough that you could predict which ones were going to test you, and on what occasions, the way the kitchen garden needed to be planted in the particular sequence she had worked out through trial and error in 3 successive growing seasons. He received this knowledge with the focused attention he brought to everything, and added to it his own observations and skills, and the combination of what each of them knew began to produce a management of the land that was more capable than either of them operating alone. They hired Hector Mendez back in April, when word came through Cimarron that his mother had recovered, and he was looking for work in the territory again. And Hector arrived back on the property with the particular pleasure of someone returning to a place they had genuinely liked and found it improved rather than diminished in their absence. He was a compact, capable man in his 30s who had grown up in northern New Mexico and knew the land with the fluency of someone whose family had been on it for generations, and his presence let them expand the cattle operation in ways that had not been possible with 2 people, and a great deal of determination. Hector was the first person outside of their immediate circle to know about the baby, because Georgia was showing enough by May that concealment was more effort than it was worth, and because Hector was, In addition to being a first-rate ranch hand, a discreet and genuinely warm-spirited person who responded to the news with the uncomplicated pleasure of someone who has watched a person through hard times and is gratified to see the hard times producing something good at the far end of them. "This is wonderful," he said, with the direct simplicity of a man who means exactly what he says. "The two of you this place. It's right." Georgia, who had not expected to be moved by the statement, was moved by it, and Silas put his hand briefly on her back and she leaned into it, and Hector pretended to be very interested in the fence post he was examining. The summer was long and hot and full of work, and the fullness of it was the best kind, the kind that comes from being invested in the outcome of the work rather than simply compelled to it. They pushed the herd up in June and brought them back in September, and in between Silas and Hector, repaired the barn roof entirely rather than patch by patch, which was something Georgia had been planning for 2 years and had never had the manpower to execute. And the new roof went on over the course of a week with all 3 of them at various points on the structure. And when it was done, it was sound in a way the old roof had never been, and Georgia stood in the barn and looked up at it with the particular satisfaction of infrastructure that will outlast the people who built it. She and Silas had their first real argument in July, which she later considered an important milestone, not because of the argument itself, which was about whether to sell 4 of the older cattle in Springer before the fall market or hold them until October when prices historically rose, a question on which they each had data supporting their position, and on which neither of them was obviously right, but because of how the argument was conducted and how it resolved. They argued it out fully and with heat, at the kitchen table after supper, both of them making their case with the particular precision of people who respect the other person's intelligence enough to actually argue rather than to manage or deflect. He did not condescend to her, and she did not defer to him, and eventually they agreed on a compromise: sell 2 now and hold 2 until October. And the agreement felt like something arrived at rather than imposed, and after they agreed Silas leaned back in his chair and said, "You are the most formidable person I have ever had a conversation with." And the way he said it made clear that this was a compliment of the highest available order, and she felt it in her chest the way she felt all the things he said that were true. Their son arrived on a night in late September, which was the same time of year the cattle came down from the mountain, and the aspens went gold, and the air had that quality of crystalline cold at night against warm days that was the particular signature of fall in the territory. The birth was attended by a midwife named Mrs. Cordova from Cimarron, a woman of 60 who had delivered half the children in the county, and who presided over the whole business with the efficient calm of someone for whom this was neither miraculous nor alarming, but simply the reliable continuation of a fundamental human enterprise. Silas waited outside the bedroom door with the contained agitation of a man who is accustomed to being useful and has been given nothing useful to do. And when Mrs. Cordova opened the door and told him to come in, Georgia was lying in the bed with the baby against her chest and looking at Silas with an expression she had not planned and could not have planned because it was the expression of someone who has just done the most remarkable thing of their life and is watching the person they love understand it. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, who was red-faced and extremely new and apparently displeased with the general arrangement of his circumstances, and then looked at Georgia, and the expression on his face was the one she had seen in February in the morning light when she had told him, the expression of someone receiving more than they had allowed themselves to hope for, amplified to the degree that the actual arrival amplified everything the anticipation had only gestured toward. "He's perfect," Silas said, which was the kind of thing people always said but which sounded, the way he said it, like a precise and considered observation rather than a conventional one. "He's furious," Georgia said, which was accurate, the baby having escalated his displeasure into a sustained expression of it. "He comes by that honestly," Silas said, and Georgia laughed, which she had not expected to be doing in the first 5 minutes of her son's life, and the laughing felt like the right sound for the room, the right sound for the whole of it. They named him Robert James Holloway, the Robert for her first husband, because Robert Wallace had been a good man and deserved to be remembered, and the James for Silas's father, who had died when Silas was 19, and whom he spoke about with the careful love of someone who has had a long time to make peace with a loss, and the Holloway because this child was part of everything they were building together going forward, and the going forward was the right direction. Hector took on extra work during the weeks after the birth, moving through the daily management of the property with a quiet generosity that neither Georgia nor Silas had to ask for, and that they were both grateful for without needing to make a production of the gratitude. Hector was the kind of person whose goodness was entirely practical, expressed in the things he did rather than in any announcement of his intentions, and Georgia thought that she had been lucky in the people who had come into her life on this land, and that luck was perhaps not the right word for a thing that was partly the result of having built something worth coming to. The autumn of 1879 was the best autumn Georgia could remember since before Robert's death, which was a measurement she made not as a comparison or a ranking of her affections, but simply as an honest accounting of the quality of her days. The property was in the best condition it had ever been in, the cattle herd at 31 head and healthy, the root cellar full, the grain store secure under its new roof, the west pasture fenced and productive. She was 32 years old with a husband she loved and a baby who was learning, day by day, to be less furious with the world, and she stood at the edge of the south pasture on an October morning with baby Robert on her hip and looked at the mountains and the aspens and the red earth of her 40 acres and felt the whole of it, the 4 years alone and the year of Silas and the accumulation of everything she had built and fought for and refused to give up. And the feeling was not triumph exactly. It was something quieter and more durable than triumph, something that had the weight of permanence to it. Silas came up beside her. He had been mending the section of fence at the corner of the south pasture, and he had dirt on his forearms and his hat pushed back, and he looked at her looking at the mountains and then looked at the mountains himself. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking about spring," she said. "I want to add 10 more head." He smiled. "Of course you are. And I was thinking," she said, "that the house is going to be small." He looked at the house and then at the baby on her hip and then at her. "It might be," he agreed. "There's room to extend it to the west," she said. "Hector thinks we could do it before winter sets in hard if we started in the next week or two." "He's probably right," Silas said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him the way she had been leaning into him since January in the dark kitchen, with the wind trying to undo everything she had built. And Robert made a sound of interest at a bird that had just crossed the sky above them, and Silas lifted his free hand and pointed at the bird and said, very seriously, as though the baby would understand it, "Meadowlark." And Robert watched the sky where the bird had been with the concentrated attention of someone taking inventory of a world that was enormous and new. They started the house extension the following week, and Hector was right that they could finish it before the hard winter. And they did, with 3 weeks of work that added 2 rooms to the west side of the house, a proper bedroom for the baby and a room that Georgia immediately designated as her office for the ledgers and the property accounts, because she had been managing those accounts at the kitchen table for 4 years, and she had always wanted a room specifically for the purpose. She sat in that room on the first evening it was finished, at the small desk Silas had built for her from pine boards with the lamp and the ledger, and she opened the ledger to a fresh page, which was a thing she did at the beginning of every new accounting period. And at the top of the page she wrote the date, October 14, 1879, and the name of the property, which she had never named in the ledger before because naming it had always seemed like the kind of optimism available only to people whose claim on it was secure, and she wrote, Wallace Holloway Ranch, 40 acres, Colfax County, New Mexico territory. And then she wrote the numbers, the cattle count and the grain stores and the preserved goods and the cash on hand, all of it, the entire honest inventory of what they had, and the numbers were better than they had ever been. And they were hers in a way they had never fully been, not because of the deed, though the deed mattered, but because of the addition of everything she had allowed herself to want that she had spent 4 years telling herself she could not afford to want. She put down the pen and listened to the house around her. She could hear Silas in the kitchen, the sound of the stove lid, the clink of a coffee pot. She could hear Robert making the soft sounds that babies make when they are in the borderland between awake and sleep. She could hear the wind outside doing what wind in the territory always did, which was remind you that the land was larger than any of your plans for it. And she loved the sound of it for the first time in a long time rather than bracing against it, because the wind outside and the warmth inside were the two halves of the same equation now, and the equation balanced. The following spring came with the violence and the beauty that springs in New Mexico always did, the sudden flowering of things that had spent all winter pretending to be dead, the return of the birds, the greening up that happened almost overnight after the first warm rain of the season. The cattle went back up the mountain with their usual conviction, and the kitchen garden went in with a plan that was more ambitious than any she had planted before because they had the labor now and the infrastructure, and she had been thinking through the winter about which crops she wanted to add. Robert was learning to pull himself upright using whatever piece of furniture was near enough to grab, which produced in him an expression of intense personal triumph every single time, as though the accomplishment of vertical were new and remarkable regardless of how many times it had been achieved. And Georgia watched him working at it one afternoon in the kitchen, while she was making bread, and thought that she had not understood, in the years before him, how much she would love this particular quality of human beings, the unself-conscious insistence on standing up. Silas came in from the south pasture that afternoon dusty and warm from the spring sun, and poured himself a cup of water at the pump and watched Robert conducting his vertical experiments with the leg of the kitchen table, and his expression was the expression of a man who has been given more than he expected and who has not stopped being surprised by it, the good kind of surprise that does not diminish with repetition. How many cattle did Hector count this morning? Georgia asked without looking up from the bread. 33, he said. 2 of the younger cows are looking close. This week, maybe next, she nodded. I'll check on them this evening. He sat down at the kitchen table, and Robert immediately redirected his vertical research toward his father's boot, which apparently offered better leverage than the table leg, and Silas looked down at his son attempting to use him as a climbing structure, and said, in the voice of a man addressing a serious engineering problem, "You need to bend your knees more." Georgia watched them from across the kitchen, her hands in the bread dough, and felt the ordinary, extraordinary abundance of the moment, the light through the blue curtains and the smell of bread, and the sound of her husband talking to her son about the biomechanics of standing up, and thought about the morning 4 years ago when she had stood in the yard behind the house, and screamed once into the empty air, and then gathered herself and gone back inside to face the alone of it. And thought about October mornings on the ridge and a dark bay horse, and a man who had said he was staying, and had meant it the way some people mean things, with the whole weight of themselves behind it. She had stood at the edge of everything she had built alone, and looked out at it with the specific pride and the specific exhaustion of someone who had done a hard thing, and would go on doing it because there was no alternative that did not involve giving up, and giving up was not something she was constitutionally capable of. She had stood at that edge, and a stranger had ridden up and said he was staying, and she had measured him with the experienced eye of a woman who had learned to be accurate about such things, and she had found him worth believing. What she had not expected, standing at that edge, was that the edge was not where she would stay. What she had not expected was that the property was not the finished thing but the beginning of a finished thing, that the 40 acres of red earth and piñon, and the house with the blue curtains were not the whole of what she was building but the foundation of it, and that the foundation was strong enough to build on, and that she had built it exactly right. In the summer of 1880, Georgia was expecting again, which she told Silas on a morning in July the same way she had told him the first time, standing at the kitchen window with her coffee, except that this time when she said it, his response was different from the overwhelmed stillness of the first announcement. This time he came to her and held her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and said, "I love you, Georgia Holloway," which was a thing he said regularly by that point, but which never stopped carrying its full weight every single time. "I love you too," she said, which was equally true and equally full and equally something she had not known in the October of 4 years previous that she would have occasion to say to anyone ever again. The second child, a girl they named Clara Me, was born in February of 1881, and she was from the first day in possession of the particular quality of absolute certainty about her own importance that second-born children sometimes develop as the only viable response to having an older sibling who has been practicing the business of personhood for longer. She and Robert conducted their relationship with the combination of affection and competitive intensity that would come to characterize it for the rest of their lives, and Silas observed their interactions with the detached fascination of a man who finds the people around him genuinely interesting, which was one of the things Georgia had come to love most about him, the fact that his attention was genuine rather than performed. The property grew. Not recklessly, not in the speculative way of people who were betting on the territory's growth rather than building something specific, but steadily, in the way of people who know what they have and respect it enough to grow it carefully. By 1882, they were running 52 head and had hired a second ranch hand, a young man from Mora named Eliseo, who was 20 years old and hardworking, and who learned from Hector with the focused attention of someone who understands that the knowledge available to them is worth acquiring seriously. Georgia expanded the kitchen garden into a proper market garden and began selling produce not just at the Saturday market in Cimarron, but by arrangement with a boarding house and a small hotel that had recently opened as the railroad began to bring more people through the territory. The railroad was changing things in ways that were both promising and cautionary, bringing commerce and also bringing the kind of land speculation that had always been the territory's particular vulnerability, and she watched it with the measured attention she brought to anything that might affect her position. Clarence Dodd, as it happened, had overextended himself in land speculation and sold his holdings and gone back east sometime in 1880, which Georgia learned from Thomas Alcott with a satisfaction that was not malicious, but was certainly present. In the autumn of 1882, Georgia stood again at the edge of the south pasture, this time with Clara on her hip and Robert running ahead of her toward where his father and Hector and Eliseo were bringing the last of the cattle down from the mountain, and the aspens were gold against the blue of the sky, and the mountains were iron-colored in the afternoon light, and the air smelled of snow coming and wood smoke from the house behind her. She looked at the land that was hers in every sense that mattered, the deed and the work and the years and the love of it, the land that had cost her more than she had expected to pay and given her more than she had known to ask for, and she felt the full inventory of it, every fence post and every cattle count and every winter survived, and every morning begun in the dark with a lamp, and the certain knowledge that the work was hers to do, and that she was equal to it. Silas had seen her from across the pasture, and he was walking toward her now, coming up the slight rise from the lower gate with the particular ease of a man who has been moving through a specific landscape long enough that his body has learned it, who fits the land the way the land fits him, which was a thing that could not be rushed or bought or forced, but only arrived at through time and presence, and the quiet sustained act of choosing to stay. He came to where she was standing and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and Clara put her hand out toward her father, and Silas took her small hand, and held it with the careful attentiveness he brought to everything important. And Robert came running back from where he had been racing ahead, flushed with effort and the specific ecstasy of small boys moving through large spaces, and crashed into his father's legs and said something about the cattle that was only half comprehensible but enthusiastic, and Silas listened to it with full seriousness, and responded as though every word were worth receiving. Georgia looked out at her 40 acres, and the mountains beyond them and the sky above everything. The enormous New Mexico sky that was the same sky it had always been, but was somehow different when you were not looking at it alone, richer and more complex and more worth looking at. And she thought that the heart was indeed a practical organ that kept its own accounts, and that hers had been keeping accounts all along, tracking what was owed and what had been paid and what was building in the columns on the right side of the ledger where the gains went. And the ledger was in excellent condition, and the gains were real, and the property was sound, and the family was whole, and the country spread out around them in every direction under a sky so blue it seemed to be trying to say something about the quality of the days available to people who survive their hard years and come out the other side into the ones that are better. She held her daughter and her husband held her, and her son ran through the October light in circles the way children run, without destination and without apology for the pure animal joy of movement. And the cattle bawled in the lower pasture, and the smoke came from the chimney of the house she had built, and she was, in every possible and practical and permanent sense, entirely where she was supposed to be. There was no edge anymore, or rather the edge had moved, had kept moving as she had built and added and expanded, and she had moved with it, and she would keep moving with it, and that was not something to be frightened of but something to move toward, the way you move toward a horizon that is always further than you expect and always worth reaching. That was the arithmetic of it, the final accounting of what a life in this country cost and what it paid, and Georgia Wallace Holloway, widow and rancher and wife and mother, and the most formidable person Silas Holloway had ever had a conversation with, looked at the whole of it and found the ledger balanced and the balance good.